Hello, family and friends. I'm Paul Estabrooks, and it's another day of sharing with you an item from the past. And today, I want to tell you about our move to Singapore. Singapore, the Lion City, and that's because Singapura, as the city is called in Malay, the first national language, means lion, and so it became known as the Lion City. But it really is known by tourists and other visitors as the Garden City. Beautifully green and lush and flowers everywhere. I'm looking out my window here, actually. We have floor-to-ceiling sliding doors there going out to the balcony. And it is a garden, and it reminds me so much of Singapore. And being home with COVID this year has given me lots of time to take care of my garden. Well, Singapore is an island city-state. So it's an island. It's only 720 square kilometers, now populated by 5.5 million people, just off the tip of the West Malaysian Peninsula, 1 degree north of the equator. So it is a warm location year-round and lots of humidity during the rainy season. Singapore is also known as a fine city, especially when we lived there in the middle 80s. There was a fine for jaywalking, there was a fine for spitting on the sidewalk, there was a fine for dropping your garbage on the sidewalk, and for even growing mosquitoes, which Diane found out about. That was an interesting experience. She was transplanting something in the backyard and left a pot with plants in water, and would you believe she forgot about it for a few days and mosquitoes developed there. And they started coming in the house. They don't have mosquitoes in Singapore because they spray the whole place to make sure they don't. And if you do something to develop them, then you get fined. And she called, fortunately she called the mosquito authorities, and they came out and they found the cause. They go, look, here, you did this. And because she was a new resident of the city, they gave her grace, and she only got a warning, but not a fine. But that was the way it is in Singapore. It is the most expensive city in the world to live in since 2013. And when we lived there in the mid-80s, it was still a very expensive city. And we were moving there from Manila. We had lived and worked with the Far East Broadcasting Company in Manila all through the 1970s. And in the summer of 1979, we transferred to Open Doors Asia, still living in Manila and working into China, as I've told you about in a number of these videos week by week. And by 1981, after Project Pearl, our director, Doug Sutphin, decided after the lots of time we spent there during Project Pearl. In fact, we found the tugboat, our tugboat for the project in Singapore, and I spent a whole month living there, jogging every morning down the east coast as the sun rose up over the water, beautifully green paths, and it was just a gorgeous, gorgeous place. I fell in love with this city during Project Pearl. After Pearl, Doug Sutphin said we need to develop support bases right here in Asia, not depending on Western countries. And so he divided up his territory into regions. There was of course, at that time, Australia and New Zealand were part of our Asia team, and they became a sub-region. Japan and Korea became another, and then there was Southeast Asia, which needed to have a location, and of course Singapore was the logical place to have a location for a Southeast Asia support base. So that's how it all started. And our moving to Singapore was an answer to many, many prayers. The first prayer, of course, was that Open Doors could even get registered there. And in 1982, we began exploring the possibility, talking with, one was a Christian businessman who was a personal friend of Lee Kuan Yew, the founding Prime Minister of Singapore, who did such an excellent job establishing that city-state. Singapore became independent in 1965, so it's only been 55 years as an independent country. First of all, a colony of Britain in the early 1800s when Sir Stamford Raffles established a trading post there. Then it became part of Malaysia, and in 65 became independent, an independent country. And Lee Kuan Yew, for years and years and years, was the founding prime minister. He established a political party that's never been defeated. They've had one political party for 55 years, and it's a voting democratic state. But any opposition has never made any headway there because the ruling party does things so well in the people's eyes that they've never voted them out. And they're still in power there and doing some, I might say, incredible things and incredible policies that are worthy of following in other parts of the world. Even the way they looked after their COVID-19 situation was a significant one. Well, we talked with this minister, and that was introduced to us by a Christian businessman, very close friend of Lee Kuan Yew, the prime minister. And he said, I don't think you could ever get registered here because we know you guys are clandestine in the things you do. In fact, he claimed that Singapore authorities watched Project Pearl by satellite the whole time it was happening when we delivered those 1 million Bibles on a beach one night at 9 o'clock on June 18, 1981. I still have my doubts about that, but hey, who knows what goes on in the world of politics and international information sharing. And that was kind of a put down. We were kind of like, oh my goodness, it's going to be difficult. However, we went to prayer and we asked God to give us registration in Singapore. And sure enough, in 1982, late spring of 82, Open Doors Asia was registered to have a base in Singapore. We were registered on the very same day as Youth for Christ International. They had decided to move to Singapore. In fact, there were a couple of Canadians, well-known Canadians, working on their team at that time. So we got registration on the very same day. Well, then we had to pray about a visa, because if I was going to move from Manila to Singapore with my family, I had to have a work visa. Now, that wasn't an easy thing to get in Singapore either. And so we prayed about it, and we applied and waited and waited and waited. And in 1983, the word came, you have a work permit to be a Southeast Asia coordinator for Open Doors based here in Singapore. That was an incredible answer to prayer. But now we needed a place to live, and this was not an inexpensive city. We'd lived in Manila where prices were low and where cost of living was quite easy to handle on the kind of incomes that we were dealing with through supporters. And we needed a place to live. And in the visits that I'd made there in 82, establishing the potential for an office and interviewing people who might be staff for that office, I was introduced to a lovely young Singapore lady who had rental homes. And she said, I just happen to have one out on the street called Sunset Way. And that's a place that I could make available to you. And with your working for a charity like Open Doors, I can give you a very good price on that place. And God answered our prayers about where we were going to live. And that was the beginning of our opportunity then to move to Singapore. We moved there in July of 1983 so that the kids could start school there that year. They were going to be going to Singapore American School, which we had to pay for, of course, much more hefty price than Faith Academy had been in Manila. And God provided the resources through supporters for our kids to go to Singapore American School. Now, if they were there today, There's even a Canadian school there now. They could have gone to a Singapore Canadian school. But in those days, there was just SAS. But it was an excellent education they received there. Well, it's one thing to have an empty house, but what are you going to put in the house? And the first thing you need are appliances. We needed a stove and fridge and whatever else was available for living day to day in a new place. And of course, Singapore had the 50-cycle appliances, so we couldn't bring our appliances from Manila, which were American electrical system style. And so we prayed about what can we do to, furnish this house. And the Lord answered our prayers about that. There was a family that we knew in Manila. We went to Union Church together, which was the biggest thing we missed about the Philippines, besides the friendly people, was Union Church. We had such a wonderful experience at that church in our years in Manila. And there we had met a family from the United States who company moved them to Singapore. And they had lived in Singapore for a number of years, and now were being transferred home to Indianapolis in the United States. And they said, hey, we have a whole house full of appliances. We're not going to get much for them used anyway. You may have them. And so this wonderful Christian family donated all of their appliances, washer, dryer, even a dishwasher. And of course, living in the Philippines, we had never had a dishwasher except me. And my wife used to joke that her dishwasher is getting old and working very slowly. In fact, it took her a year before she even used that dishwasher because she had never used a dishwasher before. This is 1983, remember, in a Asian country. Well, we were so thankful to the Putmans for these appliances that we received from them. Now, there was lots of public transportation in Singapore, and still is. In fact, it's the best and easiest way to get around the city. But on the weekends, I was going to have to do church meetings. And boy, for the 3 years we lived there, I did a lot of church meetings. It was a wonderful city to be exposed to and to be able to share about persecuted Christians. And I needed a vehicle, of course, to get on the weekends with all my equipment, because in those days we showed 16 millimeter film. And so we'd have to take these big bulky projectors and the reels and all of that. And books for the book table, and it was no easy carry if you didn't have a vehicle. Another family who we met actually just in Singapore from California, the Snyders, were so kind as to offer their second car. They had a second car, and so they gave us their second car every weekend. And so every weekend we had a vehicle to get around and to do all the different things we needed. For Diane, the biggest shock was the price of food. Everything in Singapore is imported. It's a city that produces nothing in terms of food, and everything is imported. And of course, they export a lot of things. It's the second largest shipping harbor in the world after Rotterdam, and it was incredibly expensive to buy groceries. Diane went to the grocery store, and she would look at some foods, like especially meat, and she would just stand there and cry. She's just going like, I can't believe how expensive this is. I can't afford this. And she would almost be in tears every time she came home from the grocery store. And she went to a ladies' Bible study every week through the church that we were connected with in Singapore. And one day they were asking her for her prayer requests, and she said, this is not just a prayer request, but what do you ladies do about the cost of food here? She said, we lived in Manila for many years, and when I come here, I just can't believe the price of food, especially meat. And another American lady, whose husband was a banker, they now live in Chicago, good friends, said to her, "Oh, could you use meat?" And Dan says, "I've got 3 hungry kids and a hungry husband, and I could always use meat." She said, "Oh, my husband gets donations of meat all the time from clients at the bank. And we don't know what to do with it. We just put it in our freezer, and our freezer's just chock full of stuff that the 2 of us just can't eat up." Well, they came over with a carload of frozen meat to put in our freezer. And Diane was just so thankful that God even answered her simple prayers for meat and money for food and groceries in those 3 years that we lived in a very, very expensive city. My job was to be the Southeast Asia coordinator. That meant I was supervising what happened in Indonesia for Open Doors, which was basically development, fund and prayer raising, and in Malaysia, right next door to Singapore, just to the north. And there, God brought me a incredible young man named Sebastian Chun, who became the director of Malaysia, and later, when we went home to Canada, became the director for Singapore as well. He was a lovely young man, still is, by the way. In case you're watching this, Seb, you are a great brother. And he was a great encouragement to me and did a tremendous work up in Malaysia, sharing with churches and through Christian bookstores, the ministry of the persecuted church. Then we had a base in Thailand, where from Thailand we worked to the east into Laos, Cambodia, and Vietnam, and to the west into what is today Myanmar, or then called Burma, because Burma did not allow any materials into their country that was in the Burmese language from outside. Now, we could take lots of English Bibles into Burma without any challenge, but if you brought in Burmese language Bibles, that was illegal, because they insisted that everything in Burmese language had to be printed and approved inside the country. Of course, the Bible was on a very low priority scale because Christians were a small minority in Burma, and frankly still are to this day, even though the church has grown significantly there. And so Bibles were just never printed inside. And so we would take them in suitcases for believers who needed them. From Thailand, our base in Thailand, headed by Sunny. And Sunny, I just met again last year, is still there, still working so hard for the Lord of his ministry, Ethnos, in Thailand. Well, that was the turf that I carried. So I traveled in and out of Bangkok from Singapore frequently, at least 1 or 2 times a month, and then down to Indonesia, bringing, in those days, Alkitab, which is the name of the Bible in the Malay, Bahasa Malay and Bahasa Indonesian. They were available in Indonesia readily, but not so much in Malaysia, so we would transfer them between those 2 countries as well. So that was a 3-year period that our family looks back on as a highlight of our life. Singapore was such a neat place to live. We met so many wonderful people there, and we were able to do many, many things because of its location right in the center of Southeast Asia. The kids at Singapore American School got very much involved in sports. The school was big on sports. Tanya played basketball, volleyball, and of course football is the big American sport. And they set up football teams from the youngest kids in public school, elementary school, right up through high school. And so our kids were involved in football all the way there every Friday night and all day Saturday. there were games at the school's football field, and there were parents there all the time. It was like one big long weekend party of football game after football game. And so all of our kids were involved in that. Melinda was a cheerleader. In fact, she won an award for cheerleading. That's her on the far left. Tim played football. He played defensive end for his team. And he loved the game, and we loved watching him play. Even his mother, when he'd get tackled, or when he would tackle somebody hard and make a lot of noise, she'd start screaming, "Tim, Tim!" And he'd stand up and put his hands on his hips and say, "Mom, I'm okay," and walk back into the game. Tanya was a medical worker. She was a sports medicine person for her team, another team. And you can see her backpack there on the right as she has her medical kit ready to help any of these kids that get hurt playing football. Today she's a nurse and still doing her medical work. But this was the one thing that all three kids were involved in together throughout our 3 years there was football in Singapore. While there, I was able to visit Vietnam and Cambodia with my colleagues, and I talk about that in video number 18 here on my YouTube channel. And you can see that story there. That was in 1984. In 1983, our whole family went to China on a Bible delivery trip. We met Pastor Samuel Lamb while we were there. And in the next 2 weeks, God willing, I will be sharing with you those stories here on this video series. That was a highlight of our life, too, to be able to meet with this best-known house church pastor who spoke English, and I have some video clips of him that I'll show you as well. Last year, 2019, our oldest granddaughter, Cassandra, and her husband, they were just newly married, came with me to Asia. We went to Bhutan, where Jim and I did some training sessions with young Christian leaders there. And we stopped in Singapore on the way home in order for them to see this incredible garden city that's become such a tourist center in their area, with so many incredible buildings and structures and parks and all kinds of things for tourists to do. But for me, Singapore is the city where God answered prayer for me and our ministry.